Gothic literature is one of those popular genres of fiction that, rather than having a recent resurgence or anything, seems like it's never really gone away. From its origins in late 1700s fiction written by poetic Brits, to its reinvigoration of works like Dracula and The Picture of Dorian Gray in the late 1800s, and the continued success of it in modern-day culture, stories of cultural subversion, supernatural happenings, ill-fated love, and hauntingly gorgeous environments continue to amuse readers young and old alike. For about as long as Gothic literature has existed, however, queerness has existed alongside it in some form or another. Early authors like William Beckford and George Bryan had gay affairs in their lives, arguably manifesting in explorations of then subversive sexuality, and subtext became outright text when the late 1800s rolled around, and authors like Sheridan Le Fanu wrote stories such as Carmilla, wherein a young woman named Laura finds herself seduced and charmed by a powerful older vampire lady. Before that lady is killed by the men in Laura's life, her subsequently being rushed back to a dull world. At no point has Gothic horror been a strictly European and American phenomena, however, and following that, neither has queer Gothic horror. Works adhering firmly to the genre and works taking inspiration from it have popped up all over the world since time immemorial, and there are few examples of it within Japan that I would personally consider as fascinating as the game I'm covering today. A story of a beautiful monster seducing a vulnerable younger lady with love that was never meant to last, changing the both of them forever. A story of the past and present intertwining and in human beings fighting for human beliefs. A story of the horrors of eternity and the pains of the mortals. The story of a Jorogumo named Hatsume. Released in late 1997 exclusively for Windows PCs, Atlach Nacha is one of the most standout titles in the early days of visual novels. At a time when the genre was going through a deep identity crisis, when no one was really certain what it was going to become, people were throwing whatever they could at the wall to see what would stick. And while much of that was not great, there were gems in that era. And certainly, what renowned Fujoshi and lead writer Hunmiya managed to cook up within the team at AliceSoft is one such gem. Set in then modern Japan, Atlach Nacha tells the tale of a ruthless hundreds-year-old spider demon or Jorogumo named Hatsume rising from her slumber and turning a high school into her own personal nest, seducing women and cannibalizing men in order to regain her strength and do battle with her arch-nemesis, the Buddhist monk Shirogane. In the midst of it all, however, she stumbles into a meek girl, Kanako, being assaulted by a group of delinquents and saves her, the two quickly forming a relationship as horrible as it is beautiful, with glimpses of Hatsume's humanity coming through in it. With Japanese mythology and Gothic horror ideas translated into a classic school Yuri setting, Atlach Nacha is a crazy mix that works together beautifully. Yuri at this time was still growing out of its roots in stories of fleeting, gay till graduation romances between women, as temporary yet as impactful as the kind of love which characters such as Laura experience with Carmilla, and with Japanese folklore being filled to the brim with semi-human creatures perfect for exploring how society creates and alienates supposed monsters, mixing all of it together is a match made in heaven for the toxic Yuri girlies out there. And for the time, that was a shocking change of pace. While visual novel Yuri works are still somewhat rare, back then I don't think anyone had ever seen a game like this, since the Japanese software rating board was still deeply homophobic during the era. Silverdine has arguably improved, given that the greenlight title like ever made it in the previously covered very gay, very trans Dasaku, but that doesn't make Atlach Nacha's existence back then any less miraculous to me. And I am so glad it snuck through the committee of grumbling old men, because it is a killer piece of queer Gothic fiction that stands among the best. And with some of what it goes into, it does arguably have a little Lovecraft in there too, besides the title pulling from the mythos. Exploring ideas of the horrors of eternity, cycles of abuse and the patriarchy, extreme moral grayness, and the beauty in humanity's fleeting nature, it is one of those games where I'm shocked it hasn't been translated to English twice over already, and one that I am incredibly excited to finally get to. Just like I'm excited to talk about the sponsor of this video, Very OK Vinyl. Vinyl records. Everybody loves them now. Whether you're a hardcore collector of thousands of dollars in equipment just for listening to obscure dad rock, or a casual enjoyer who loves zoning out on the couch to mind-bending ambient tunes, there is something for everybody being made for the turntable, and that includes things for fans of indie games and visual novels too, with one of the best companies out there serving that niche being Very OK Vinyl. Based in Ontario, Canada, Very OK Vinyl is a label releasing beautifully mastered and high-quality records for soundtracks of games you know and love, or will certainly come to love when you hear their tunes. From Nitro Plus classics like Scion no Uta and Steins Gate, to PC98 gems like Metal Orange and Rusty, not to mention indie darlings like Bag of Milk and Necrospear, and so much more, Very OK Vinyl has a fantastic selection that only keeps getting bigger. This month is bringing Astrophysics album Hope Left Me to pre-order, a haunting, atmospheric, and highly creative record with a fascinating visual novel tie-in. At nearly an hour long, it is a great dark electronica album well worth listening to. It doubly so and paired with Very OK Vinyl's usual fantastic packaging and mastering that makes all the releases really shine. pipeline. If that or anything else they have to offer sounds up your alley, then head on over to veryokvinyl.com and reserve your copy while pre-orders last. And be sure to sign up for their newsletter so you don't miss any future drops, as there's always cool stuff in the pipeline. And plus, they've got plenty to offer from other brands and labels, including a wide selection of anime soundtracks, city pop, imported Japanese albums, more game music, film and TV scores, and so much else. A huge thanks goes to them once again for sponsoring these videos like always. And again, that is veryokvinyl.com to get your hands on some awesome music. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the story of Hatsune and see what lays within her nest. Long ago in Edo, Japan, there were once beings known as Yorogumo, mysterious demons that can shapeshift from their natural form of grotesque spiders into that of beautiful women. Grander and more fearsome than any arachnid humans know, there was one that brought ruin to a certain village, Hatsune. And yet, one day, a Buddhist monk named Shirogane took it upon himself to fight her and her incredible powers, the two deeply wounding each other in their battle. Long has passed since then, and the two once again, now in modern Japan, find themselves preparing to fight. In need of energy, however, Hatsune goes on the hunt for a place to begin her new nest, somewhere filled with women to enthrall and men to cannibalize, ultimately deciding on the Yaesaka High School. But on the night of her arrival, she catches wind of a going-on, a group of delinquents filming the assault of a girl named Kanako Miyama. Ruthlessly, they tear into her, and Hatsune, despite her apparent lack of care towards humans, suddenly becomes enraged at the sight and decides then and there she will kill those worthless creatures. In a flash, Kanako's world is enveloped in white and red, silk web and crimson blood, as the frightening and beautiful assailant leaves as soon as she appears, deciding against consuming Kanako as well. But the next day, Hatsune appears in the school as a new transfer student, and Kanako once again finds herself stricken by her. Meekly, she thanks Hatsune for what she did for her, and asks if she won't take her as her own and protect her, even knowing that Hatsune is a monster. Even as Hatsune pushes her against the wall and whispers sweet and cruel nothings into her ear and makes clear what she is, Kanako insists she will stay by her side for all eternity, by One-sama's side, for doing what she wanted to do to those men, but couldn't, and saving her. And so, with a shy and fragile girl clinging to her, Hatsune begins her mission to rebuild her strength in earnest, and through it learns more about the inhabitants of the school. Not just Kanako, whom she continues to bond with and grant as much safety as she does perform cruelty to, but others such as the sweet though sickly Sachiho Takano, the Watanabe siblings and their complicated love triangles, the kind country boy Kazuhisa Katsuragi, and many others, as she decides who to turn into a thrall and who to let live in her quest for unholy vengeance. But just who is this Shirogane that Hatsune is winning so desperately to fight, and what is he after for himself? How did Hatsune become such a ruthless killer? Was there ever any humanity behind the monster? How much cruelty can Kanako truly stand by, and can she really bring out Hatsune's humanity? And what will become of the relationship when the time has come and Hatsune must fight her greatest foe? All of these questions and more lay in the hands of fate, and fate is as cruel a mistress as the immoral and brutal woman which Kanako cherishes. From the first scene, something that stands out about Atlach Nacha is its incredible ability to build atmosphere. The Gothic fiction is a genre known for its oppressive moods established through evocative prose, dark settings, and creative framing, and Humya continues that trend through writing a powerhouse of an opening, shifting from curt, poetic prose evocative of a time long gone as atmospheric music plays, to the current time of creative, flowing narration, all with art presenting nightmarish sights and soaked in dreary colors. Within the intense first half hour that makes up the majority of the plot synopsis I gave, Atlach Nacha makes clear exactly what you're getting into. A deeply morally gray story of a messy and fucked up romance between a human and non-human that pushes social boundaries, and a ruthless protagonist that bounces between hero, anti-hero, and pure villainy with mere instance. And the game carries this atmosphere and prowess all the way through and even beyond its ending. Probably the best way I can describe the feeling of the atmosphere is fragile. Even though you have some level of control over what happens in the game, everything everywhere feels like it's barely hanging on by a thread. Schools are, famously, sites of ridiculous drama and heightened emotions, and all Hatsune has to do to create circumstances favorable to her is bring those pains to the surface, seducing and setting people up to create drama, manipulating others to curry favor, and so forth, all just to swoop in with a magical kiss that turns them into mindless drones. But you get the sensation that even if she wasn't there, something would eventually happen that would break these people because there are far deeper roots for their problems existing. It's a very uneasy setting that feels like a perfect adaptation of the oppressive manners of classic Gothic fiction into a modern setting, with narration that spares no expense on highlighting the difficulty of existing in it, particularly for for someone like Kanako who suffers from constant anxiety and antagonism. The writing expresses the feelings of claustrophobia and fear that dominate being somewhere that continues to hurt you, with her only reprieve really being Hatsune and a few other sympathetic students. It is quite impressive given the narration is delivered not in the first person like VNs tend to use, but entirely in the omnipotent third. It's written in a way that feels much closer to something like interactive fiction rather than a typical VN or paperback novel, leveraging its extra visual, oral, and interactive elements to offer swifter prose, but still placing greater emphasis on words to set scenes and explain how interactions proceed than you might normally see. Through this style of narration, Fumiya showcases some genuinely impressive writing chops, clever and pointed word choices, evocative phrasing, subtle detail, and incredible character voicing. And both the narration and dialogue are really able to get you into the headspace of characters that I think many writers would struggle with fleshing out. There are very few VNs where I could say that no word here is merely filling a necessary count, and that every single line carries some sort of significance without feeling overbearing, and this is one of them. Fumiya also shows through her writing a fantastic talent to set a basic atmosphere and smoothly transition out to other moves through it. In a way reminiscent of games by Izumi Banya, such as Extravaganza and Shin Yukokimi, both previously covered, Atlach Nacha can shift fast from tragic sorrow to romantic intrigue to intense action to melancholy relaxation, all while never losing that kind of ambient tension present in Gothic works like Dracula and The Haunting of Hill House. This is very, very important here because unlike most visual novels, Atlach Nacha doesn't have the same structure of long-term shifts in the story. Opting for Hatsune to kill or let live a character often only has a big impact on the current chapter and sometimes subsequent chapter, and it is rather immediate, and the ending of the game is the same no matter what you do. In other words, you may be able to change your pit stops, but the finish line is in the same place. The world is going to change and the lives of characters with it, even Hatsune's. AliceSoft is a company that's had a rather famous, or maybe infamous, track record of morally gray to downright reprehensible protagonists, and Hatsune Hirasaka is one of the most noteworthy examples of this. A bisexual femme fatale with flowing dark black hair and porcelain skin, she's lived for hundreds of years with incredible powers that threaten even the bravest of combatants, as proven for her fighting what would be any demon's greatest foe and coming out alive. Hatsune's stated goal from the very beginning of the game is to fight that foe, a Buddhist monk, the very icon of human peace, and she's willing to do whatever it takes to get the strength to do so. For a Jorogumo or a spider woman such as her, that means eating the flesh of men and turning women into empty husks to drain of fluids, often manipulating people with her looks and wit to curry favor or breed animosity, preferring to play with her prey rather than simply take it as it is. She's as pure chaotic neutral as a character can get, regularly doing unjustifiably horrible things in the pursuit of what seems like an unjustifiably selfish goal. And yet, there's always this lingering feeling that there's something deeper not just to her conflict of Shirogane, but her as well. She speaks detachedly of times in a horrible past that feel like possible hints at a life she once lived. She shows genuine warmth and love to Kanako, and she has moments of befuddlement at modern-day things or emotional outbursts that betray her otherwise collected and formal old-timey demeanor. For as awful as Hatsune is throughout the game, and she certainly is horrible, Fumiya does a really good job at giving you constant hints that keep you invested in trying to understand why she is how she is, with the shit bricks ending being one of the most revelatory and powerful moments I've seen in visual novels. While I doubt you'll forgive her by the end, because I certainly did, I can almost guarantee that you'll eventually see her as a tragic figure suffering from the world's ails rather than a pure evil villain. She's also really fascinating from the context of her environment. But like I said before, Atlach Nacha portrays Skull as somewhere that's legitimately unsafe and frightening for a lot of people, with a lot of characters inside it who break others for their own amusement. And though they might be impenetrable villains in other media, Hatsune disposes the worst of humanity with horrifying ease, just as she disposes of those completely innocent. Atlach Nacha's narrative never really tries to get you to believe someone is evil or good in and of themselves, and instead focuses heavily on trying to present their mindsets and their feelings without a biased slant. This, as far as I see, is nothing but benefits to the kind of story Fumiya wants to tell. The omnipotent third-person prose is often utilized to give immense depth and character viewpoints of victims in a way that doesn't feel coddling or minimized, but pointed and realistic. But it also often forces the reader to empathize with complex and flawed people they may otherwise not, and genuinely think why it is they hate them and their actions. Though there are some who are clearly irredeemable, shown in horrific ways that have grotesque and brutal desires to hurt others, there are others who seem genuinely confused and lost or put on airs to hide complicated pasts subtly portrayed for the prose. Ultimately, this empathy is what allows the game to very effectively ask a recurring question: who deserves to be sacrificed in the name of a cause? Because Hatsune kills almost indiscriminately, but you as the reader are forced to think on even the most clearly good of these killings while feeling even more horrified at genuinely good people being caught up. All of this adds up to make Hatsune one of the most captivating anti-hero heroes in Yuri media and VN period. Capable of deep love and affection that can turn into cruelty, she operates on a sense of morality that you are always trying to get a feel for. She does terrible things for debatably good reasons at points, and she has a rich history that keeps you wanting to read more and try to understand if she perhaps was not always a monster. And Kanako is maybe the strongest driving force in showing that humanity. Kanako Miyama is the prototypical gay kohai to Hatsune's role as a gay senpai. A shy girl born to a rich and overbearing family and a regular target of bullying and sexual assault for her demure personality, she's as fascinating a figure as Hatsune and certainly an incredible contrast to her, as Kanako sees in Hatsune a sense of safety that nowhere else will afford her, neither family nor school. Growing up without a mother, her father was the only person that really raised her, and he is shown to be deeply controlling and uncaring about what happens in her life, demonstrated maybe most painfully in him hiring one of his work colleagues to transport her to and from school after learning about her spending time with Hatsune, ensuring that she has no life he can't surveil. The story walks a very fine tightrope of giving Kanako the agency as a person to behave in uncontrived and realistic ways by acknowledging that what's realistic for a traumatized victim of familial abuse and sexual assault isn't always happy. Faced with an abusive home and tortured social life, Hatsune, with her murdering, sometimes controlling tendencies, and dubious sexual ethics, might be bad for her to be around, but that still gives her more freedom than anywhere else. To say nothing of the fact that Hatsune actually gives her earnest affection and love. The two have a deeply troubled relationship that draws very obvious parallels not just to the morally fraught and challenged relationships of monsters and humans in Gothic fiction, but more clearly to grooming. Hatsune is an older woman who takes on someone barely of age, giving her the kind of affection and marginal freedom that her family life doesn't afford her, while still also isolating her from her peers at multiple points in the story. While she seemingly only has intentions to protect Kanako, and we'll get back to that far later, it doesn't change the fact that their relationship is very sus, as the kids would say. This younger and innocent, older and wiser type of dynamic is something that I think many queer people have been in, whether under healthy circumstances or not. As people who can face quick harassment if we out ourselves with the wrong people and often have significantly more shallow dating pools than cis-het people, it is very easy for us when we're young to cling to people who can grant us safety or acceptance, or promise it. Hence, during my teens, I fell into an abusive and coercive relationship with someone much older than me, and once I turned 18, I grew close to someone else who gave me the kind of affection that I felt I needed at the time. And not long after, we ended up in a weird liminal pseudo-relationship thing. They helped me to figure out my identity, gave me a social space that at first felt safe, and in many ways they did a lot of good. But many of the foundations that relationship was built on and the turns it took were rotten from the beginning in ways I tried to put out of my mind. Even so, when they offered to help me leave my home a mere 2 or so years later, I was happy to accept their help and further spread my wings, as it were. And while I did get to do that in many ways, I also found myself being isolated, chewed up, and spat out in ways I'd never been before. What I felt then was mentorship, care, and guidance revealed itself to be, at least in part, manipulation and abuse. I felt unable to deny sex because I was afraid of upsetting somebody who had been deeply unstable around me and was partly responsible for my housing. I was covering for money and life mishaps that weren't my responsibility, and I felt scared to make many new friends because it'd be seen as a threat to the relationship. That relationship, in many ways, wasn't even codified as one. It was ambiguous and nebulous, even further strained by her being in a relationship I was told over and over again would be fine with me present as a love interest, when that never was really the case, and only becoming clear how much I was being strung along when it had ended. It was a relationship that seemed too deep to be a friendship, but too shallow to be romance, and that really became obvious when the moment that it could have become true romance and a true relationship, I was replaced by somebody else. I've been out of that relationship for a while now, but all the peculiarities of it still stick within my head and really hit me as I read Atlach Nacha. While the decisions these characters make are often ones clearly fated for failure to us as spectators, the writing is strong enough, detailed enough in its character backgrounds and motivations to make you understand why someone would cling to someone who hurts them and those around them, what kind of rationale they use to justify it to themselves, and why someone would do these things to that person. The narration never casts judgment on Kanako for opting to cling to someone who's clearly hurting her, nor does it paint Hatsune as some knowingly evil overlord actively trying to hurt Kanako's life. You are forced to make your own decision based on knowing how these characters are feeling, something which I think is very important for making their dynamic work, because it gets you absorbed in that messy kind of sometimes good, sometimes bad, toxic love that is very hard for authors to authentically nail. Even beyond this, however, the kind of fleetingness in it, which characterizes early Yuri works often called Class S, is a key point of Hatsune and Kanako's relationship that really hit me. The former is someone who will inevitably move on to something else in their long-lived life, and the latter is someone who has seen little middle of the world and clings desperately to the first thing which offers them affection. But you know that this relationship could never last forever, no matter how much Kanako wishes for it to, which is also a very Gothic romance. It's not so different from the love which characters like Laura and Camilla share, a seemingly misunderstood and ill-fated monster and a human yearning for something more, torn apart by the very circumstances of their lives and the systems which built them. Over all of it hangs a sense of ethereality, that this is all temporary and they'll all come to an end before either is ready to face that. Those themes of eternity and mortality run deep within Atlach Nacha's story, and I think the way they evolve throughout the narrative is one of the greatest strengths of it. And it's woven not just into the fleeting, broken, yet loving bond our protagonists share, but the fates of all the characters big and small who dwell within Yae Saka. Besides our two messy lovers, by far the most important player in the plot is Shirogane, Hatsune's sworn rival who's unable to enter her nest due to the barrier she places around the school, and instead watches from afar, warning others not to fall prey to the spider's temptations and poaching potential allies to aid in his goals. Which, while you'd presume those to be pure to defeat the awful evil of Hatsune and her wickedness, we already know that there's more to Hatsune, and he does make some very questionable choices in the game. Even more so than Hatsune, Shirogane is an extremely difficult character to talk about without getting into spoilers and discussing the ending chapter. But like with Hatsune, there's far more than enough teases towards something deeper that questions of his nature and intent never stop being captivating, particularly in the bits of local religious texts and ancient stories interspersed throughout the narrative. In the interim though, there's a whole other cast of interesting folks to zone in on. For instance, there's Sachiho Takano, a rather quiet and kind girl who struggles with her health and has an unrequited, even contested, crush on a man at the school. Takehiro Watanabe, a studious shonen who's stuck in a love triangle. Kazuhisa Katsuragi, a swell country boy who finds himself attracted to Kanako. Tsugumi Watanabe, a bright girl and ace swimmer who struggles with the Crow Club supervisor, and Rin Yagami, a Shinto priestess who takes notice of an evil presence at the school and aims to solve the who and why behind it. A lot of players have noted that outside of the main couple and Shirogane, Atlach Nacha's characters aren't particularly fleshed out, especially Rin, and while I do agree with that to the extent that they're far from the detailed cast of some previously covered small VNs like the cosmic horror title Kusari Hime or the Taisho era drama duology of Bokuten and Canary, they are still more than captivating enough and genuinely have more to them than some heroines of games at the time, like fucking Kizuwato's characters. Each of these characters gets more or less an entire story chapter dedicated to them of varying lengths, splitting the game into a total of 7 parts when you include the epilogue and ending chapters. And of them all, I would say my favorite is probably Kazuhisa because he's the only other character in the game that acts as a possible romantic interest for Kanako, which not only brings out the best and worst of Hatsune's protective instincts, but brings some interesting drama into Kanako's character arc. And while writing conventions would dictate that I bring an example of my least favorite to counteract this, I can't exactly do that because I really do think that every single arc here is fascinating in its own ways, either because of the individual themes they go into, because of how much they add to the atmosphere, to the overall story arcs, or just for having insanely memorable moments and tonal shifts. Like seriously, for as little as Takehiro's chapter adds to the story, it's still a fun ghost story and nothing prepares you for the first time that throwing into the banquet plays during a fight scene. I did mention before that Atlach Nacha has a somewhat unique system for managing all these story arcs though, and that comes in the Liberate, Enthrall, Kill system. Besides being an entertaining variation on everyone's favorite group call game of Fuck, Marry, Kill, it's what sets Atlach Nacha apart from other VNs structurally, as your primary way of changing the story is deciding whether or not Hatsune lets someone live, takes them in as a brainwashed source of energy, or murders them for nutrients. To get the bad out of the way first, while I do think it's fascinating in the abstract terms of how it affects the narrative, the actual implementation of this leaves a lot to be desired. Because all your decisions are as big as whether or not a character gets to live or die, this means the way a chapter can end or some finer details of the next can change drastically depending on your choice. I really think that some of the chapter variations, especially the more morally kind ones, are far less interesting in terms of drama, thematics, and character development, and one chapter can even be missing depending on your choices. But on a more positive note, I am glad that AliceSoft was willing to try this system out because it represents an inventive way of thinking about player choice in visual novels. Far from minor decisions that require galaxy brain deduction to see the long-term value of, choices here feel immediate and impactful, written in ways that feel like they encourage you to choose what would make sense for Hatsune to do, rather than obey your moral judgment as a self-insert. To me, it is highly reminiscent of the modern era of interactive fiction games and how every decision warps the world in front of you in some way, but the way everything interlocks so perfectly to lead up to one singular ending is some impressive story structuring, and the inevitability of it all coming to an unchangeable collapse feels like a fantastic thematic parallel to the vintage Yuri manga thread of a relationship that will never last. But because of how severe an impact you can make on your reading experience by making certain choices, I would still highly recommend following the guide available on the website Sakao's. The first playthrough it suggests is well crafted to show all the game's best moments while leaving the rest for replay or later collecting. It's also how I'm going to be speaking of the story once I get to the spoiler segment, since I don't really feel it's necessary to go over the different variations on how the plot plays out. If you want to see this yourself and don't know Japanese, then go get Manga Gamer during their next licensing survey to bring this over or something like that. Something I will talk about with absolutely no idea how to transition into it though is the sex. Atlach Nacha is one of the first games I've covered in a while, frankly since early this year, whose sex scenes feel like they are, for the most part, not meant to be gratifying, with very few exceptions, all of which I consider very contestable. Atlach Nacha once again channels Gothic horror of the past by turning sex into something alluring, but in far more ways horrifying. From the first scene of Kaneko being assaulted by a group of men as Kurt text carefully skips over and elucidates on details, the disturbing ways in which Hatsune ensnares and uses her victims all throughout the game, Atlach Nacha really does not hold back on how people can use sex and desire as methods of control and torture in a way that feels evocative but not ever excessive or indulgent. It's also the key way for which the game shows how much of the violence that we associate with monsters and stories is just as present, if not even more so, in humans. This is a pretty common theme of Gothic horror on the whole, and humans are the real monsters is perhaps a bit cliched today, but being edoge released in a time that was at least marginally less sexually closeted in Victorian England, its literal gay jailings, Rumia had a lot of freedom to say the quiet parts out loud, and my god, did she say them loud. So many of the most reprehensible and horrifying acts are performed in this game by men given absurd amounts of power over vulnerable people, something of which Hatsune, even in all of her dubious and downright brutal moral compasses, finds so disgusting that she murders the group assaulting Kaneko in the intro on sight and has the option to very happily kill another perpetrator later in the game. How power is unjustly distributed in societal systems is a subtly huge part of the game's atmosphere of oppression and anxiety, particularly regarding sex. Almost nowhere, almost nothing, almost nobody feels safe for many of the women, and the fact Hatsune triumphs over it all leads to as many moments of satisfaction as it does visceral dread over what she can do on a whim. And her particular disdain for these kinds of people is, without getting into spoilers, a very important detail on how the reader's perspective of her later ship. Arguably, the only reprieve from all this in terms of sexual content are the most loving scenes between Hatsune and Kaneko, which, very heavily colored by the questionable ethics of their relationship, can feel genuinely sweet and show a more tender side from Hatsune and a more emotionally vulnerable side from Kaneko, which gives a glimpse at a possible happy world for those two. Something important I've not talked about up to this point is the artwork. Atlach Nacha was primarily illustrated by Onigiri-kun, probably best known for his work on other AliceSoft titles like the Beat series. While I have never played those, I've always found his artwork to be uniquely pretty, as while his style is one that's certainly evolved over the years, it never really felt like it's tried to be whatever was dominating otaku spaces, making for a fun evolution to trace against an ever-changing landscape of new moe blobs. And as much as I adore those, I do still enjoy sharp-eyed older ladies and beautiful bishonen men. His very early work here in Atlach Nacha is probably the closest he's come to being in line of anime artwork of the time, but it still feels strikingly different from what other brands of the era were doing, and even AliceSoft themselves, who spent the entirety of 1997 artistically weaning themselves off the aesthetic sensibilities of PC98 illustration and into the more modern era of digitized artwork on Windows. To get the negative out of the way first, I do think this results in the game feeling somewhat confused when it comes to how it handles rendering. There's a very specific, "you're telling me I photoshopped this?" vibe to early 256 color Windows VNs like Too Hard and Canon that comes through and how some of the CGs look here. Meanwhile, others seem as if they were hand-colored to varying success, and yet others look beautifully detailed and considerately colored and shaded. I feel like I complain about this inconsistency every couple of videos, but it's a peculiarity of the PC98 to Windows transition that lasted into the early 2000s and even beyond, and wherever it turns up, it kinda sticks out like a sore thumb. While there was a talented staff member supervising all the CG creation here, and I'm sure they did a lot to tie things together, reality is that there are still at least 8 different artists assigned to this game, which is a hell of a lot for anyone to manage. None of this is to say the art is bad, however, because I think Atlach Nacha is a looker on the whole. The rendering being a bit inconsistent in the CGs doesn't mean they aren't overall fantastic pieces that add an immense amount to the game's vibes. Some are comforting and gentle, others are tense and atmospheric, and yet others bring up emotions in me that I don't really know how to describe. Is this fear? Is this arousal? Am I realizing I want a pretty spider lady to rip my guts out? And when it comes to the general assets used in the game, like sprites and backgrounds, I find all of them really charming and appealing. The sprites feel ripped straight out of a shoujo manga with puffy outfits and gentle proportions that call little attention to the character's attractiveness, in stark contrast of usual eroge designs, and honestly making the sexual horror here stronger. The game also only has a single standing sprite per character, which is a really fascinating aesthetic choice that I've never seen anywhere else, but works super well. And the backgrounds being in a distinctly different style from the rest of the art really helps to benefit the overall atmosphere and give a feeling of contrast, wonderfully illustrated by artists Munekyu and Yoichiro. Of course, any discussion of Atlach Nacha's art and aesthetics will inevitably lead to people gushing about the music because it was composed by none other than the legend himself, motherfucking Shade. Getting his start as the person in charge of rearranging AliceSoft's PC98 FM music for CD audio, he quickly rose up the ranks and became a fan favorite when he was put in charge of the soundtrack for Only You, everybody's favorite legally questionable SRPG dating sim homage to G Gundam with a soundtrack that has far outlived the rest of the game's legacy. Honestly, I should probably just do a video on this game one of these days. Ever since that fateful release in late 1995, Shade has gone on to be one of the most celebrated composers in Japanese gaming by those who know him, working on titles like Demon's Roots, Sakura no Toki, Sengoku Koihime, Azure Lane, the Atelier series, and many other AliceSoft titles, but also working with VTubers like Sakura Miko. If you are an otaku, even if you don't know Japanese, then chances are you have encountered him and not known it. Man has been around the block, and I am so fucking happy I finally get to talk about him on this channel, let alone in one of his best works. Atlach Nacha might only have 15 tracks on its soundtrack, but every single one of them is perfectly crafted to be like shots of dopamine and serotonin straight into the eardrums of 90s game music loving people like myself. Without a doubt, the most iconic track from the game, with a huge and very spoilery exception, is Red Tint, a haunting atmospheric piece that plays during many of the game's more mysterious segments, mixing ideas of traditional Japanese music writing with subtle electronic instrumentation and interlocking counter melodies layered on top of each other beautifully, with impressively smooth transitions between different segments of the piece. On a more dour yet still somehow motivating side is Weeping Cause, which really highlights Shade's prowess in bringing the absolute best out of budget 1990 synthesizers like the Roland SC88 Pro he was fond of during his early career. From smart usage of artificial guitar scrapes to simulate the sound of a real player enacting the tone-setting acoustic riffs, to the hypnotic woodwind melody running against the articulated string section, it's one of the most captivating pieces whenever it plays in the game. Showing yet further diversity in writing ability is Luring to Insanity, which uses the double harmonic scale so often associated with faux Middle Eastern music in a unique and clever way that avoids evoking images of cheap cultural mimicry. Instead, it makes an atmosphere of discordance amplified by the abrasive and clashing melodies and punchy drums, all brought to a head in a breakdown that shifts time signatures and tempo in a very attention-grabbing way. And lastly, before I speak more generally, I have to mention one of the other most iconic tracks from this game, Going Into the Banquet. Without a doubt, one of the most blood-pumping, adrenaline-raising tracks ever put into a video game. From the second you hear that rising violin riff and arpeggiated guitar intro, you know you are in for something special. And when the full arrangement comes in, you are hooked into a tune of strong progressions, catchy melodies, and funky bass lines that will never leave your head. Look, I know I call a lot of soundtracks incredible and some of the best on this channel. I can be a slightly hyperbolic woman, and as someone who has been writing music for a decade and making game music for many years now, I have a lot of love to share with other composers and their amazing works and talents. But trust me when I say that Atlach Nacha's soundtrack is, even more so than many I've showered with praise on this channel, a fucking masterpiece, one that has inspired me to write amazing pieces since long before I played the game. Shade just has this really special talent for crafting memorable and simple to understand melodies with complex layers and reasoning behind them that flows so effortlessly. All of his choruses, verses, and breaks flow seamlessly into each other no matter how varied they may be. His instrumentation is fun and exciting, willing to break conventions to fit atmospheres, while doing so with wonderful programming that makes it all come together and with a great sense for leitmotifs. There is an earnest passion, fun, and excitement in his writing that makes it clear he really loves his work, and it's so awesome, man. I goddamn love this score, and it's so well implemented into the game for the most part. Like, there are a few tracks that are only used once, and let me tell you, having somehow never been spoiled on them, there were points this game had me crying and screaming, and Shade's music was the main reason for that. The only thing I can even vaguely nitpick is the implementation of the tracks that aren't used one time. Some friends made the joke that how Red Tint is used as a bigger filter to players in the game's engine, and we'll get to the engine. And that's because it and a few other tracks are kind of overused. Like, there's an entire 45-minute stretch where nothing but Red Tint plays, and as much as I am an autistic woman who will listen to the same songs and repeat forever for comfort, I also like to choose when I do that. No other track is quite as overused as this, but it really does feel like the program scripters were really pushing all 8 of the common use tracks as far as they could, which would have been game-breaking were Shade's music not infinitely re-listenable, or if he wrote shorter tracks than he did. I would love to see this game get remade and have some extra music added to address this, but as it stands, we're good. No major complaints here. What is infinitely more concerning, however, is the engine this game runs on. Atlach Nacha uses AliceSoft system Free.x, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. Most of my experiences with it, however brief they've been, have generally been fine, as it's a flexible little dude that does a great job at managing a lot of different types of gameplay systems and RPG-style dialogue, even if some of those gameplay systems can feel like God pulling a prank on unsuspecting passerbys. As a novel-style visual novel engine, however, it is so anemic I couldn't even think of a good joke. The backlog is insufferable to use. The text rendering can be janky and changes between click to advance and click to complete line, then again to advance, which means you will skip over dialogue that you're never going to be able to reread without spending way too much effort, and it doesn't even have the most basic accessibility and configuration besides only skip red text. I know visual novels did not have a set standard for accessibility and customization options for a very long time, and even modern games running on modern engines like Soft no Uta can feel very bare bones in terms of UI and button configuration, much to the detriment of people like me who really don't like black text with a light outline for Japanese, or have issues with their hands slipping because of muscle control. But this game is missing things that existed even back then and has implementations that are so blindingly horrendous. Also, sometimes games on the engine just do this, and I do not know what the fuck is happening here. I'm one of those people who believes that remakes should be reserved for technically inaccessible or bad games first, and perfectly working good ones second, and Atlach Nacha is a prime fucking example of the first. I know AliceSoft is a husk of its former self right now that's been slowly dying for 8 years, but God, if you're watching this, please make it possible for this game to get a remake with the same staff on a modern engine, all of its miscellaneous issues fixed, or at least a fucking re-release that runs on an engine that isn't deaf. Even as it stands though, I absolutely believe Atlach Nacha is 100% worth playing through because the atmosphere it creates, the narrative it weaves, the characters it explores, the themes it explicates are all so incredibly fascinating, resonant, and meaningful that I believe everyone who enjoys dark queer horror needs to check it out. And in order to fully dive into why, I'm going to be getting into deep spoiler territory. If you know Japanese or are holding out hope for a translation and would like to play this game unspoiled, then consider skipping ahead to the closing segment where I give my final thoughts. But not before listening to the Patreon segment where I thank the donors and sponsors who make this all possible, answer questions, and shout out cool people that you should check out. Meowdy y'all, and welcome to the Patreon segment, that time of the video where I give shoutouts and oh dear God, I can't keep this up. Hi y'all, welcome to the Patreon segment where I try to ascend to catgirlism, give life and channel updates, thank the donors that make this all possible, shout out cool people, answer questions, and other neato stuff. With the first of those completely failed, we can move swiftly on to the life updates, which, well, the elephant in the room is a trans person who grew up in the US is what just happened there a few weeks ago. I was hopeful that things wouldn't go to the worst possible outcome, and while I haven't been speaking much about this publicly, I've been deeply worried if people I know are gonna be okay, when I'll be able to go see them again, and just a whole ton of other anxieties and feelings of dehumanization. I'm mostly holding up fine now, but combine that with some other life events, and it's been fucking rough lately, man. If you are in any position to help people get through this, be it for donating to charities, encouraging and or organizing local activist movements, creating informative and educational content to help combat misinformation and or give people something comforting to view, or whatever else, then now more than ever I think it's extremely important to helping people get through this. There's a lot we can still do, and fostering community is one of the biggest and least risky things we can do. I personally will continue to create what I'm creating, as well as to give good friends somewhere safe to stay, and hopefully early next year put out something musically related to raise funds for LGBT and immigrant safety causes. I'm not sure if it's gonna be an album or just a pack of sounds for a popular synth or whatever, but I figure I ought to try and do something beyond just making these videos. And it's on this note I once again want to thank everybody who makes these videos possible. It's because of your donations that I'm able to hold a steady job in a safe place, something which seems to be decreasing for trans people at a rapid rate, and it's because of how many you donate that I'm able to make said job my primary living without a fear of going broke. It makes me really happy to see people say these videos inspired them to improve themselves, to be more sympathetic to disadvantaged people in their lives, to create art that goes against a violent and discriminatory cultural milieu, and so much more. I don't have any pretense that what I'm doing is nearly as much as many others are, but I do know people need entertainment and inspiration, and I'm happy I can provide at least that much for some. So thank you all again so much, and I hope I can keep providing a safe and inspiring place for years to come, and empower others to do so too. With that very heavy stuff out of the way, I'd like to take a moment to once again highlight some people and stuff that I think y'all should check out, whether it's been suggested by viewers, I stumbled onto it myself, or it's fans suggesting their work to me. And if you would also like a chance to be shouted out, consider dropping me a line on the former Bird site, Blue Sky, Tumblr, Patreon DMs, or even email. I'm always looking for cool new folks to shout out and give much deserved attention to, and like I said a moment ago, community is more important than ever. And the first of those I'd like to give special notice to is Ava's Literary Parlor, a YouTube channel all about book recommendations, analysis, exploring different genres, and other neat booky things. I first stumbled on her when I was doing some research for this video and found her essay titled Homosexuality and Gothic Fiction in the Victorian Era, which is exactly what it says on the tin. It is also absolutely fantastic, as is the rest of her content. Whether it's book recommendations, genre histories, or anything else, it's all very entertaining, informative, and cozy, so go and check her out. The second thing I want to recommend is the game Concrete Flesh by Juno Death, a viewer of mine who sent in this free 15-minute title by Patreon DMs, and it is just so good. There is very little I can say about it without spoiling the whole experience, so I'll just say that if you enjoy dark poems, pretty industrial landscapes, and melancholic atmospheres, you should absolutely check this one out. Again, for free, it is fantastic. Okay, with those recommendations now stuck in your mind palace, I want to take a quick moment to do something I haven't in a while and answer a bunch of Patreon questions. There's some really fun ones, so let's go. Habibi asks, have you watched the awful Suinosora OVA? Indeed I have. It was actually something my husband suggested on a whim back around like May or so, and I still look back at it fondly as one of those batshit things ever made. Take a Sip Babes asks, have you read or interacted with the When They Cry series at all? I read Umineko back in early 2020 and don't remember much of it, and I've seen bits and pieces of Higurashi here and there, both reading the VN and watching the anime. I don't remember a ton of Umi's story after all this time, but it's got some pretty killer music. Thywork asks, what are some recommended Doom mods you like, if any, or any boomer shooters you've got your eyes on and or played already? Especially interested if you played Hedon. I unfortunately have not yet played Hedon, though I really should. I actually haven't kept up with recent boom shoots in the slightest. The last I touched on them was playing the excellent Quake 2 remaster all the way through, and I thought that was fantastic. I thought it actually made the game way better. In terms of Doom mods, I contributed music to Elementalism, so I'm kind of biased to liking that one. ZR7 asks, have you or do you have any plans to read and cover Orituba? I actually have a box copy of it. It's crazy long, so I'm not sure when I'll get to covering it, but it would be nice to. Rand asks, do you have a favorite setting when it comes to visual novels? Hard sci-fi and urban fantasy, same as with books and films. Habibi asks, any Japanese song or artist you're currently obsessed with? The band Sotai Seiriron, but also any song from Maiko from Bang Dream. I swear to God, my husband showing me that anime permanently rewired my neural pathways for the better and the gayer, which is also the better. Mauer Duck says, asks, interesting that you always praise Brazil so much in the context of how shite the US is. As a complete outsider, I used to see Bolsonaro versus Lula as analogous to the Orange Man versus whatever Democrat. Do you have any thoughts on that? Okay, so I have not lived here long enough to really say much, and I know Brazilian politics are a fuck, so I'm just gonna give my quick thoughts on this as like someone just living their daily life in a fairly nice neighborhood. People are nicer to me here, I can get my medications without problems, and I don't feel threatened in the same way I always did in the United States. But really, to quote my husband talking about Brazil versus the US, Brazil is like the gay United States. That means it has a lot of problems, but it's gay, so it is better. And finally, CDP1802 asks, what's your favorite kind of meat? Well, if I have to put cock aside for a moment, beef first and lamb a close second. It used to be lamb, then pork, but moving to Brazil and going to a churrascaria made me a changed woman. Alrighty then, with all those questions answered and our usual sponsor here mentioned earlier in the very beginning, go check out Very Okay Final, they're very cool. I think it's time we wrap up this segment. Once again, I have to thank everyone who makes these videos possible, and if you want to join that group of cool people flying by on the side of the screen, then consider donating to the channel by Patreon or Ko-fi, one time or monthly. In exchange, you'll often get early video access, the ability to see the videos with the funny Drakengard bars. Get your name on the side of the screen in this segment. You can ask me questions that I'll answer here, such as games to cover, see monthly updates, and other neat things, all for a minimum of $1 per month. There's no tier gating, and everything is accessible by any amount. One-time donations do not get the stuff though, just because of weird crap with coffee, but if you donate one time and you want to see anything, just tell me. And if you don't want to donate, that is totally okay too. Not only does simply watching, commenting, liking, subscribing, and especially sharing help a ton, but it's a tumultuous time for many people in many parts of the world. Take care of yourself and the people around you first, and if you want to donate, my stuff will always be here. I simply appreciate any support at all. So once again, thank you all so much, and let's get back to the Toxic Yuri show. Though Atlach Nacha's narration jumps from character to character during its duration, Hatsune is ostensibly the focus of the story and the one from which everything pivots off of. She is the one who saves Kanako in the intro and courts a story-defining romance with her, which we'll return to shortly, but is also the one who turns an unsuspecting high school into her nest and unearths all of the dark secrets within it. At the beginning of the game, much of the drama is, at its base, something that should feel familiar to anyone who's seen a J-drama or played a romance VN before. Everything kicks off when Hatsune learns of a love triangle between Sachiho Takano, a sweet and quiet girl who's particularly friendly to Hatsune, Takahiro Watanabe, the student council president, and Miyuki Hotta, a volleyball player who once kissed him in the past. Also when there is Tsugumi Watanabe, Takahiro's sister, who is very defensive of him. Through talking with both Sachiho and Miyuki, Hatsune is able to learn more about their dynamic and ultimately the drama around the school itself, culminating in her enthralling Miyuki, using her to set Takahiro up and make rumors of them kissing spread around the school, and incite feelings in Sachiho that make her vulnerable to falling to Hatsune's whims, ultimately killing Miyuki in a jealous rage induced by Hatsune's power, and finally turning her into a full-on thrall. It's a series of very dramatic events that really establishes the feeling of an everyday world being intruded on by an evil and influencing force, played so straight and with such careful writing that you can't help but get absorbed in the intensity of it all. And the setting of a school, a time where everybody's feeling heightened emotions they can't explain, really helps to sell it all as believable. But what this really allows the game to do is lay the groundwork for everything that comes. With Hatsune now thoroughly intertwined in the drama of the school, the rest of the game is able to go far heavier in commentary and theming, starting with Tsugumi's chapter. A talented member of the swimming club and a shining star at the school, she's become the focus of the club advisor, Iguchi Gosuke, a power-tripping man who stalks her and desperately wants to take her for himself, even rewatching security tapes of her while imagining what he could do. He is insufferable in an unfortunately very realistic way, and putting the annoying stereotype of ugly overweight person as evil aside, compelling villain that goes about his evil deeds in a distinctly different way than Hatsune. His presence also leads to a genuinely great scene between Kanako and Tsugumi, who are both harassed by him and talk amongst themselves about how horrible he is, finding humor and solidarity in their mutual confusions and bonding together. It's a cute moment of girls talk that's just written so earnestly and of so much care, and really captures the sentiment I've had in all the times I've dealt with awful situations by talking with people who were familiar with it, both of us getting through it by having a laugh at the absurdity of what we were going through and making it feel less scary in our minds, even if the material reality was still awful. It also leads to another one of my favorite moments, this time in Kanako and Hatsune's relationship. Throughout the first chapter, the two's relationship is mostly uncontested and unthreatened for better and for worse. Kanako feels like she has found safety within Hatsune, and Hatsune shows Kanako a lot of love and provides her safety, a second and more real home away from her overbearing family. But she also does a lot of very questionable things, like bringing the half-dead body of one of her abusers to her so she could deliver the killing blow, and punishing her if she chooses not to. An act of obedience or disobedience so important to Hatsune that it sets a flag called transgression, unique to Kanako. It is by no means a healthy relationship, but it is for Kanako the only love she's ever really been shown, and the only chance she's ever had at a stable partnership. But that changes after the conversation with Tsugumi. On the night of that day, as she's cuddling with Hatsune, Kanako's mind wanders. Is Tsugumi someone she could see herself with? Is she merely a friend, or is that a warmth she feels towards her the same kind of love she feels for Hatsune? Does it even matter, given that she knows Hatsune wouldn't allow it? In the end, Kanako doesn't really find a satisfactory answer for these feelings other than to just put them off, which I feel is the final touch on this expression of a struggling queer youth moment that I cannot say how many times I experienced during my teens, when I was trapped in a very unhealthy relationship online with a person much older than I. I think everyone during that age feels love for pretty much anyone who passes them by with grace, especially when you're queer and the dating pool feels microscopic, but there's a special kind of pain and contemplation when you're already in something controlling you, and you know that trying to explore that pool would mean abandoning what grants you a sense of safety. I remember constantly having crushes during my teen years and wishing I could explore more, be with other women and men and see what that was like, maybe even people who were near where I was, if I could somehow convince my family to let me out and find others in the first place. But time and time again, any interest in that, any desire for something different was treated with yelling and abuse. I felt locked down to the relationship I was already in, scared to leave, scared if I'd actually find someone who liked me again, and I just learned to shrug off my emotions every time they flared up. Of course, that wasn't healthy, and I credit it with giving me a lot of the insecurities and fears I still struggle with to this day. Making the decision to leave that and escape that false sense of safety felt like one of the hardest decisions I'd ever make at the time I made it. And because of bad luck with the subsequent awful relationship, I had to do that twice. Though I am far happier for doing so, I also get why people struggle, because I did too. You don't want to lose your safety in what has been a cruel world to you, even if you feel or know kinder things might be out there. And I can guarantee you they are. Unfortunately, neither Kanako or Tsugumi make it out of this chapter without being exposed to the cruelty of the world. For the former, Iguchi takes keen notice of her using One-sama to refer to Hatsune, and calls her father with a sense of smug satisfaction to tell him how his daughter is sneaking out at night to meet with a classmate, a stigmatizing act that mirrors how real-world grooming persists for adults punishing rather than offering alternatives in support to vulnerable people. While the full repercussions of this aren't seen until later, Tsugumi finds herself immediately faced with escalating harassment. After Hatsune threatens to murder Iguchi, but ultimately pulls back when Tsugumi expresses unease at the thought of it, and because, to paraphrase and quote, hiding a ball of flesh like you would be cumbersome, Iguchi grows enraged with the challenges to his authority. That same night, his desire to pay back, his targets of undue affection reaching their all-time highs, he does what he had been desiring to do for so long, and catches Tsugumi on her bike back to her parents. Donning a mask to hide his identity, he grabs her tight to his body and assaults her. She tries as hard as she can to scream, but is ultimately stunted by her mouth taped shut. Though it lasts only minutes, it feels like an eternity as she cries in suffering, and he thinks to himself how powerful he is. The event only stopped when all of a sudden, a certain monk shows up. In a flash, Iguchi is knocked down and out cold. The mysterious man with flowing silver hair and donning ceremonial garb only says this to the frightened and quaking girl.
Child, do not let yourself become possessed.
Scared, alone, hurt, and confused, Tsugumi runs home in a pained hurry, ignoring her brother and parents alike to be alone, and the hollow, self-serving nature of Shirogane's words soon show themselves as we see him chase after Iguchi, the monk seeing a possible asset in the man. Alone in her room and unaware of what is to come next, Tsugumi could do nothing but attempt to sort the whirlwind of emotions in her mind out. She felt every part of her being violated and ruined, with her brother who swore to protect her unable to do anything. All that came for her was a monk who left her with cryptic advice, congratulated himself on his wisdom, and vanished. Him breaking it off didn't ease the pain that had happened. Nothing would. All that's left in her now is agony and hurt, fear and anxiety that every day, every single day, she'll have to go back to school with that man more enraged than before. Oh, no one knows what he did to her, and she can do nothing about it. Nothing but come to school the next day against her better wishes, holding out hope that her brother can protect her. That day, while Hatsune is strolling about the school and setting the last pieces of her plan with Sachiko into motion, she catches Tsugumi on the bench and talks idly with her. But the conversation shifts when she notices something on her: a silver hair. Shirogane's hair. Suddenly frightened and anxious, Hatsune attempts to ask Tsugumi what happened last night and where she met him, where she met that man, before suddenly, someone Tsugumi never wanted to see again appears. Iguchi, driven mad by some unknown cause, attacks the both of them. In retaliation, Hatsune lashes at him and defeats him in one fell swoop, uncertain whether to let him live and attempt to learn more about the escalating situation of Shirogane, or to kill him for his disgusting and reprehensible actions. Ultimately, she decides there is no better fate for him than death, and no use for him in her plans. In what may be one of her few truly heroic acts, Hatsune puts an end to Iguchi's life. And finally, Tsugumi is maybe, just maybe, safe. While I've already gone into much of what I find fascinating about Hatsune's developing relationship with Kanako in this route, I want to take a moment to talk more about Tsukumi's relation to Iguchi, because within the culmination of all of his actions and how she responds to it is a lot of genuinely heartfelt and painful writing about how hard it is to deal with being abused by someone who has power. Iguchi is just covert enough with his harassment that no one with the authority to expel him will actually care, or likely just shrug it off as that's how it is, which allows him to more or less wear down and intimidate Tsugumi and the other girls to the point that she and the other girls feel unable to do anything about him. He is able to assault her and basically get away with it, and no one willing to do anything more than just pity her. This leaves Tsugumi with a whole whirlwind of feelings to try and sort out, with one thought in particular that stings really hard for me. She has to see that man tomorrow at the school, in the classroom, at the clubs, the man who knows where she lives, who will show up just to do something horrible. Every day from then on, she has to see someone who left her with feelings of violation she can't erase, feelings that shoot across her entire body like high voltage through a fraying wire. Even more than the scene of the assault itself, which does an incredible job at portraying the frenetic and disturbing mindset of Iguchi and the pained and frightened thoughts of Tsugumi, the aftermath has some of the most deeply sympathetic narration I've seen. It portrays the kind of sporadic headspace that sexual assault leaves someone in, feelings of fear, of deep anger, of sorrow, of disgust, of sadness, all flying around chaotically, desperately wanting them to end but knowing you can't escape. Atlach Nacha has a ton of truly incredible scenes, owing to its ability to tell a morally complex story with impressive tact, but I feel that this must be up there as one of the greatest in it, maybe just in part of because when it hit me. I'm closing in on a year now since I felt so many similar emotions, being assaulted by a man who I thought was close to me, yet was ultimately just aiming to take advantage of me as someone vulnerable and easily worn down. Because that person was someone in a position of authority, particularly someone who was an elder in the community I was in and was well loved by everyone there, I didn't feel like I could do anything. I had my privacy and sanctity violated, and I was scared that from every day on, and every single time I attempted to do anything in what was one of my only possible social spaces at that time, I would have to see him again. I'd have to hear others talk about him. I'd have to be there knowing that in the same room was someone who had photos and videos of me that he could do whatever he pleased with, treat me however he pleased, and he could get away with it so long as he put the tiniest bit of effort in to conceal it. And while I think I've gotten beyond the dread at this point, even if the thought that somewhere out there are coerced photos and videos of me being shared around makes me sick to my stomach from time to time, everything I felt that day at the moment it happened is still fresh in my mind. And while I've voiced those feelings, it often feels like my own voice hasn't reached me or even others at times of how flagrantly my feelings have been denied by people I once thought close to me. As deeply uncomfortable as this entire sequence was for me, I would say at no point it felt triggering or fetishizing or whatever, quite the opposite. It's a moment that reads to me as deeply sympathetic to people who have gone through this, a piece of a story that wants people to understand how much this hurts, words on a page meant to reach people and help people who have suffered show others what they've been through, and I guess that makes me feel heard. It makes me feel like someone understands this like I do, and I think that makes it hurt less, knowing I'm not alone. Though the two chapters that follow Tsugumi's are perhaps not as thematically dense, both of them are still fascinating in their own rights. Fittingly, the first that comes after is centered around Takahiro, her brother, which sees him hearing rumors of an apparition-like girl who hangs around the school library, seduces men within it, and leads them to their death. It's an entertaining classic ghost story type of tale that resolves in one of the game's best fight scenes, and is alone worth following a guide for, as you can very easily miss it by playing too nice. There's also a variation for Tsugumi being enthralled instead, or if the both of them are, but I don't think either of these hit quite as well as the ghost in the library, and neither gets the absolutely killer moment we're throwing in the banquet place for the first time. What is much more interesting to me, though, is the chapter that follows his. While it is ostensibly about Kanako, and the chapter is even titled after her, the main focus of it is really Kazuhisa Katsuragi, a chipper and cheery guy from Osaka who transfers into Yaesaka for not particularly clear reasons at first, and is charmed by Kanako when they meet for the first time at a food joint. A bit of a delinquent, a bit of a rebel, and seeming to have a good heart at the core of it all, he is a complicated person, and Kanako at first finds herself incredibly apprehensive to even talk to him, but she does begin to grow more comfortable with him in time, seeing him, at the least, as a possible friend, even if nothing more, as Hatsune is already her one and only love. But there's far more dire things going on in Kanako's life than a nice guy, as her home life takes a sudden turn for the worse when a letter arrives, simply saying, "I have seen the video." Baffled what this could mean and who could have sent it, given that all the men who assaulted her should be dead, Kanako finds herself more terrified of the world than ever, even more so when a few nights later, Ikuchi's little phone call seems to have succeeded at grabbing her father's attention. A cunning and powerful businessman who seems to care little about his daughter except insofar as a thing to control, he decides to make a decision for her own good to prevent her from being outside of the home after school hours, and requests one of his trusted colleagues to pick her up from school every single day to keep a watchful eye on her. Fearful she may never see her One-sama ever again, Kanako flees the home to try and meet with Hatsune, bumping into Kazuhisa along the way, and who else but Shirogane at the front of the schoolyard, preventing her from passing any further into the den. Recognizing him as Hatsune's arch-nemesis, she sprints with intense fervor once again, stumbling into Kazuhisa a second time, who offers to take her in for the night. While perhaps not the nicest place, and is basically described as a male living space, it is at least somewhere she is able to find temporary comfort and safety, something she much needs after everything. Away from the watchful eyes of her family, Kanako is able to make it to school that day with far less worry, and later return to Hatsune's nest. And though Hatsune recognizes the unfamiliar scent of cigarettes on her, and Kanako fears she may have to lie to her One-sama about meeting with Kazuhisa, Hatsune ultimately pays it no heed, setting Kanako's mind at ease as the two fall asleep together like normal. The next day, realizing that perhaps Kazuhisa is kinder than she once thought, and Hatsune more accepting than once believed, Kanako meets with Kazuhisa behind the school under the cover of the trees, where he holds her close and explains his history to her, transferring away from Osaka because he was in a relationship with a teacher, and both got expelled for indecent acts on school premises, with rumors going around that he got her pregnant. Though he, and her by his account, saw it as a normal relationship, the rules of the world still tore them apart and forced them to separate. The same rules which caused her to lose her job, her only regret in it all. Perhaps if he hadn't been a student, if she hadn't been a teacher, it would have been okay. Prompting Kazuhisa to ask, what even is sex? You want to do it because you like each other, you want to touch each other, but that's not all it is it? It's weird. This conversation is one of the cases where Fumiya's ability to talk about flawed and messy people without bias really comes to importance. Up to this point, we've seen many sides of Kazuhisa and know he can do good, most notably in recognizing Kanako's struggle and offering to take her in for a night without doing anything to her, which is the bare minimum of decency. While the story gives immense credence to Kanako's anxiety around him being valid, it also shows that she doesn't have to be. And the way his backstory is recounted in an emotionally touching and earnest way, the narration emphasizing his conflicted emotions that Kanako in many ways relates to, makes it hard to see him as a careless delinquent that the rumors painted as. It's more like someone who made a genuine mistake just as his teacher did. Both of them foolishly made a decision to engage in something that, if it isn't already clear by how I'm talking at it as a mistake, is not healthy. I feel like it shouldn't have to be said, but schools are institutions with power structures, and the people with power can greatly decide where the life of the people under them goes. This inherently means any relationship stuck in different levels of power is going to shift the dynamics of the class, lead to biases and choices, and potentially lead the person with power altering the life of someone very vulnerable in an unfavorable or deeply questionable way. This is also not to mention the significant cross-developmental age gap between students and teachers in many institutions, which in a relationship is fucked in its own ways that I really shouldn't have to elucidate. The fact there aren't always malicious intentions doesn't change the fact that what happens is bad and needs to be treated as such no matter what. But there still has to be a recognition of the humans behind it all too, the reasons why they did what they did, in order to be able to properly reflect on what happened, crucially why it happened, and face the ugly truths of social power in our world. That way we can make a broader change to prevent it from happening rather than just tossing people in a jail cell and hoping the problem goes away. It won't because there are deeper reasons. However, this moment of Kazuhisa is not the only thing that happens to Kanako that day. Back at her home, she finds something horrible waiting for her again. Another anonymous letter from the same sender telling her to go to the old gym warehouse. And it's there that she finds one of them, somehow still alive, waiting for her and deranged with lust and anger. Though she attempts to fight him off with a cutter knife, the wound only leaves him briefly dazed. In a moment of pure dread, she calls out for Hatsune, her beloved, to save her. And quickly she arrives, brutally murdering the man of her claws. And mere moments later, Kazuhisa arrives too, hearing the commotion. A man who to Hatsune is an intruder to their bond and a potential threat. Hatsune looks at him coldly and questions Kanako.
Which would you choose? Your One-sama or that man?
Begging and pleading with her not to hurt him, that he's a good person and doesn't deserve this, Hatsune stays firm to her resolve, asking again if Kanako would throw her away. And of course, Kanako cannot bring herself to abandon the one she loves most, even if it would mean the death of someone she has grown close to. A death which Hatsune gives her permission to look away from. I briefly mentioned before how the circumstances in Kanako's life mimic many of those which make grooming possible, and in more depth how the relationship between Hatsune and Kamako mimics grooming itself in many ways, and this chapter I think really puts the final pieces of that in place. The former with how her family takes away her freedom rather than offering support, and the latter for how Hatsune is prone to isolating her from other people. While I'll dive into the latter in a moment, I want to go into the former first, as this chapter is the last point where adults completely failing Kanako comes into play, and is where everything involving that culminates. Not only did Ikuchi report her relationship to him, a totally normal thing, only weird for being gay, to her family against her will, but her family, who again knows nothing of the relationship besides it being gay, decided it was best to strip her of her agency. Punishment like this famously does not end well. Authoritarian parenting, a style where the emphasis is on strict rules and stern punishment, has been linked time and time again with higher rates of anxiety, low self-esteem, poor performance, and distrust with parents. And it goes without saying that authoritarian parenting typically also coincides with a lack of tangible love and affection for the afflicted children. While we don't really get to see much of Kanako's family life, what's clear from the precious, or maybe not so precious, few moments we get is very much reminiscent of this, down to her father's concerns being less of the contents of what Kanako is doing, and more the fact that she's doing things he doesn't approve of at all, rather than attempting to show her support and learn about what's happening in her life. Any sort of parenting where the emotional needs of the child aren't met creates the kind of emotional void and desire for love that makes someone deeply vulnerable to the first person to show them care. Like I mentioned before that I was in a deeply unhealthy relationship in my early teens, and the reason why that happened is because I felt like I struggled to get the kind of care I needed from people around me. I had stressed out parents with their own problems that ended up deeply affecting me, and because I was homeschooled with highly restricted social access, I didn't have the ability to make friends my age and learn from people my age. I felt alone, so when I met people online who showed me affection and attention, I stuck with it. Even knowing it wasn't healthy, even knowing they were far older than me, even knowing I was being hurt to an extent, I wanted that attention, and it ended up warping my perception of what was healthy and what wasn't for a very long time. The best way to combat the circumstances for grooming like this is, at its core, just being nice to your kids and also people within the community being good role models for them. The teachers that are kind and open, old folks who are curious about others, parents of friends who have boundaries and make them clear but don't force them. Just being a good person who sees someone growing up as a human worthy of respect can do so much for making someone feel like they have a safe space and don't need to get attention however they can. But this is where we turn to Hatsune's handling of her friendship and potential romance with Kazuhisa. Though Hatsune's nest is a safer place for Kanako to be than her family, the reality is that Hatsune is still a very flawed being, and if the prior chapters didn't already make it clear, this one very aptly shows how her cruelty can turn towards Kanako and make her life far worse. There's an implication here, I feel, which becomes much more present after the ending, that Hatsune's decision to kill Kazuhisa is because she sees him as a potential threat to Kanako. Depending on your read, Hatsune's perspective is that she's protecting Kanako, but at the same time, isn't that kind of just what Kanako's father was doing? She sees Kanako doing something she sees as questionable, whether that's simply growing distant or hanging around with someone a bit suspicious, and rather than give Kanako somewhere safe to go and support her as she figures out for herself what she wants, rather than try to learn more about this new person, her response is to upend things entirely while emotionally manipulating her, asking that question, would you throw me away for this man? Obviously, there doesn't need to be any discarding here. It's a completely false idea that she's constructed, but that type of social restriction is as much a part of grooming as it is authoritarian parenting and really just most abusive dynamics as a whole. The goal is often, whether spoken or not, to control the environment which a certain vulnerable person lives under in order to create what is most optimal for the abuser, what fosters what is best for their needs, and what meets their beliefs about what is good for this person. Whether or not this is a conscious decision or something made of good or bad will only matters in understanding it, because the outcome is still manipulative. The outcome is what matters. But because so few people offer Kanako safety, because she doesn't have anywhere else to go, losing this sense of safety, which is only half real, is too terrifying. She almost invariably must believe in Hatsune's logic and stick with her. It's a type of rationally irrational decision making and thinking that I know all too well, and I again have to commend Fumiya for being willing to portray this without clearly judging Kanako or lambasting Hatsune. It's simply what it is because you, the reader, are smart enough to figure out that manipulation is bad. It's an immense amount of restraint on her part that allows the story to feel as grounded and real as it is, and maintain the incredible atmosphere that it does, all while allowing the characters to simply be people. People who will soon meet their final hours. Atlach Nacha's final segment, split into two smoothly transitioning chapters, is the point where the entire game comes together. All the themes and assorted ideas coalescing into one coherent whole, with little bits we've been given hints for up to this point finally combining to tell a full story. It is also the point in which everything begins to fall. As the end of Hatsune's plans near, the stage begins to shift and change. Kanako becomes ever more desperate to become a part of Hatsune's life forever, offering herself as a sacrifice so long as she does not have to return to the war which has been so cruel to her, an offer which Hatsune denies because she doesn't find it interesting. Hatsune herself starts beginning to remember more of her past, and a bond she once cherished with someone special. Shirogane has begun to reach his full power, and another person of faith has entered the fray, Rin Yagami, a Shinto priestess. While a regular third-year student for the most part, she has also found herself taking on a new, more personal duty at the school, attempting to cleanse the mysterious impurities she senses, which would just so happen to be the boundaries which Hatsune has set up that allow her to keep Shirogane away, and effectively control the minds of the people in Yaesaka High. After a meeting with the mysterious monk and seemingly falling under his influence, she systematically weakens Hatsune's control bit by bit, faculty and students alike beginning to realize that people who should be here are completely missing, and Hatsune's ability to monitor the goings-on gets worse. Where everything truly takes a turn, however, is when Hatsune meets with Rin as she's doing research on local religious myths in the library, and says something that reveals to Hatsune she may have something to do with the Shirogane lineage, that her family is in fact descended from his. The moment she coaxes this out of her, Hatsune's worry turns into rage. She unleashes her demonic claw, pins Rin to a bookshelf and strangles her, realizing what this must mean. That Rin is a relative of a child which Shirogane had of a priestess he seduced long ago. Why this in particular seems to inspire such rage in Hatsune isn't quite clear, but in her anger she nearly kills the young priestess before letting her go and wiping the memory of the event from her mind. Now knowing what she does, Hatsune finds herself even more invested in attempting to enthrall Rin and steal her powerful energy for herself, eliminating a potential ally for Shirogane in the process. Bugging her with spiders while she's knocked out, Rin wakes up with an intense lust that, despite her best efforts to fight back and destroy more of Hatsune's boundaries, drives her to run to the shrine and clean herself of her impurity. And of course, who would just happen to show up there as she's struggling, desperate for release, but Shirogane, happily willing to fulfill her induced desires and kill Hatsune's creatures, all while taking control of her to turn her into a weapon. And so, with him now guiding her rather than Hatsune, and Hatsune setting her final preparations in place, Rin makes her way to the school to show down with her, a woman of faith versus a woman of demonism. With the final preparations set and enacted, the two dash forth, arrows flying from Rin's holy bow and ropes of silk from Hatsune's monstrous body. But no matter how she might try, no matter how much power she possesses, Rin simply cannot win against Hatsune without Shirogane by her side. So confident in this, even, that when Rin asks where the final spider is as Hatsune violates her, Hatsune confidently answers to the disarmed woman, "Inside me." And in an instant, Hatsune saw a long claw piercing her skull uniform. Welcome to Atlach Nacha's closing chapter, with one of the greatest battle themes ever composed. Though Hatsune had believed that she, and a certain somewhere else, were the only two spider gods left alive, a cruel surprise comes when at the same time as her gut is pierced, she sees Rin's new true form. She too has the power to transform into a demonic beast, granted to her by Shirogane of all people it seems, and she has every intent to use it to end Hatsune's life here and now. Gravely wounded, she's left with no choice but to flee the site of battle while taking potshots at Rin, returning to her spider form form in a desperate bid to gain strength and mobility, but eventually running into Kanako along the way. There, seeing her loved one for what may be the last, she returns to her human form to bid farewell. Though Kanako begs for her not to do this, to run away with her to somewhere safe so they can live happily forever, Hatsune tells Kanako that it could never happen. Just as a spider tires of their child in time, so too will Hatsune of Kanako given an eternity together. She has to forget this all and return to her human world. But
maybe if I live to see tomorrow,
she says,
and the mood strikes me, we can play together again.
Rushing through the halls, hoping to survive only to do battle against her sworn foe, Hatsune remembers one final piece of her past that puts everything to perspective. A memory of a precious day in a field of flowers, one which she held dear long ago. A day which she excitedly told the man near her how beautiful these flowers, fleeting yet unchanging, are. A day she spent so happily with a man she revered as her older brother. Shirogane, the man who saved her from death and gave her eternal life. Up to this point, I've been cagey on providing details about Hatsune's past because despite being given vague hints at it all throughout the game, it doesn't really come together until this chapter and you're hit like a goddamn truck. So for this video, I felt it made far more sense to tell it in one go, when it became important to know what created the heartless monster that had sworn vengeance against a cursed man. Long ago in the Edo period lived a woman named Hatsune. Born and raised in the Yaesaka village, she was destined to be a sacrifice to their local god, a silver-haired spider god no one had ever seen, Shirogane, who asked if a young virgin in exchange for protection. Though Hatsune had accepted her fate that day, as an escape from her torturous older brother and tiring life, things would not go quite as planned, as it was in fact her brother who was assigned with a group of other men to take her to the altar. That night, though they obeyed their orders for most of the way, Hatsune waiting with bated breath for the ceremony to begin, everything changed at the doorstep of the shrine. Deciding that they had gotten far enough from the village, the men took Hatsune and forced her down, with her sibling taking the lead. Hatsune could do nothing to fight back but kick and scream, cry as she was violated and tortured, left in shambles, near death, swearing to herself,
I'll kill you. I'll kill all of you. I want the power. I want the strength to cut the necks off of you disgusting low-life scum.
And as if answering a prayer, yet perhaps too late, the very god which she was meant to be sacrificed to appeared in front of her when it all had ended. Flowing silver hair and a kind yet powerful presence, who saw her desire for power beyond what humanity could offer, the power it would take to get vengeance upon those who wronged her, spoke to her.
What shall it be, child? Do you have it in you to cast aside your humanity and live as a monster?
To which she said,
Please, I beg of you.
And so began the next few hundred years of their eternity. At first, Hatsune set her sights on revenge against the village which had wronged her, razing it and murdering all within. But it was not long before she began to live a peaceful life with Shirogane, believing that joy, as two beings of eternal life, could never end. But Shirogane became tired of Hatsune. He had been tired of everything human long before they had met, and decided now was the time to move on from what was to him yet another toy. With life lacking luster or charm, he began to seek new desires, and courted a Shinto priestess, bearing a child with her unbeknownst to Hatsune. But it was not long before she found out, and she became enraged, bitter and jealous at the betrayal of a man she saw as her brother, as her husband even, just so he could experience something new. And as he continued to grow more and more distant, brazen that he simply found her boring, she became more and more pained at the realization that she too would be doomed to this fate, unable to escape an eternity of horrible memories. In what should have been their final days, the two did battle. Hatsune, having enthralled the woman Shirogane cheated on her with, and attempting the same with a daughter to gain strength and satisfaction, sought to end Shirogane's life so the source of all evil could be eliminated, and he could no longer destroy others as he had her and the maiden. But as we know, this was never meant to be. They could not kill each other. At least, not until this final day. Atop a stormy roof, Hatsune by her lonesome and Shirogane with Rin by his side begin to do battle, as Shirogane affirms his reasoning for all that he has done. Everything from betraying Hatsune to leading a second life to bearing a child to turning Rin to a Jorogumo, damning her to the eternity he once sought to escape, has been to amuse himself at the cost of others. From the beginning, none of this ever really mattered to him. It hasn't mattered what happened to everyone he wronged or how much pain he's caused. To him, the world, stuck in the damnation of eternity, is a source of entertainment to escape a meaningless, empty existence that freed itself from the flows of time. Even now, this battle with Hatsune is nothing more of an entertainment to him, a rush to his senses he hadn't felt in centuries. As the two battle and Hatsune finds herself losing to a man who fashioned himself as a god, something suddenly changes the fold. Despite Hatsune's stern warnings not to, Kanako rushes in to meet with her, refusing to leave by her stead even as she's mortally wounded. Seeing Hatsune's anguish, fear, and worry, Shirogane realizes that this woman, this lowly human, must hold a sacred bond with her. And as if to laugh at it, as if to humiliate, Shirogane decides to take Hatsune for himself. The taste of flesh he had forgotten all of these years made even greater knowing the one she loves is suffering through it. But after the cruel act, after he's left Hatsune for dead, he makes a fatal mistake and aims his sights on Kanako. Desiring to turn her into a Jorogumo to force her to suffer the same eternity as Hatsune and delight in Hatsune's despair, the wounded woman, fueled by anger, pulls herself together to fight one last time, to prevent the person she loves most from suffering the same horror she has, to prevent someone else, this small, insignificant human, from losing her humanity like she did and becoming a monster. In an instant, Hatsune manages to touch her lips to Rin and wake her from Shirogane's control, pleading with her to take his staff and kill him, that he's no god but a mere man, a monster who devours humans just like Hatsune. To end his existence would be a mercy not just for everybody but him. And enact mercy she does, as in an instant, the life of a man who considered himself a god was taken away by the very people he sought to oppress. Everything, every death, sacrifice, and act of cruelty led to this moment to ensure no one could be hurt by the source of all evils again. Hatsune, broken in moments from death, gives one final act of mercy to Rin, healing her wounds in body and telling her to return to the human world she belongs to. And to Kanako, the only person she has loved in all these tortured years, who brought her humanity back out, she begs of the same, to forget all of this and to live a kind life like she deserves, untangled in triflings of false gods who would turn humans into toys and untether us from the flow of time, the flow that makes humanity meaningful. But Kanako can't see a world without Hatsune anymore, not after everything she did for her. If only she had become a thrall, then she could have lived in a world with Hatsune forever like she wanted. But there is another option. Maybe, just maybe, if Kanako truly believes in herself that she is ready for eternity to embrace her love until the end of time, then there is one option. If she were to take inside her both Shirogane's seed and Hatsune's egg, then she could bear Hatsune's child, something which Kanako wholeheartedly accepts with Hatsune's embrace, along with her transformation into a Jorogumo. Now, all that there is left to do is wait inside the nest until the child is born, until Hatsune Miyama is born. When I said Atlach Nacha had a shitbricks ending, I really did mean it. There is so much to unpack here, from how people reproduce the abuse of their oppressors, to how eternity is shown to be an anti-human hell world, but also Kaneko's decision, yet also the reframing of Hatsune's character arc, yet also the specifics of a deeply religious-seeming man trying to be a real monster and the monster was an abused person led by them all along. It's a lot. However, I think the best jumping off point for all of this is looking at Kaneko's decision to bear Hatsune's child and become a Jorogumo herself. Not only does it feature girl-on-girl pregnancy with a side of stealing the seed of the bastard who ruined your life, which is incredible, but more importantly is the ultimate culmination of how much agency Humiya gives her characters to behave in questionable ways. Kanako, in one of the most emotionally vulnerable moments at an emotionally vulnerable time of her life, pleads against the better wishes of Hatsune, insists that she is in fact ready to live forever, filled with the intense longing that a first love brings. It is by no means a logical decision, but it is one that makes sense for a character who feels so deeply betrayed by the world and the people around her, that the person she loves at this moment is the only reason for her to be alive. I think a lot of people are very familiar with that feeling. Again, to build off of what I've talked about all throughout this video with regards to toxic relationships, it can feel like them lasting forever is the only thing that will grant you safety and happiness. It's certainly not true, but Atlach Nacha's ending carries this kind of emotional volatility all the way through. And what really makes it land is a sequel short story included with the guide for the original release of the game and republished this year online for all to view freely. In the next series of Atlach Nacha, we see not just what becomes of Kaneko's rash decision to hold on to these emotions and herself for all of eternity, but what that does to her part in the next generation of people. Some 14 or so years later, Kanako and Hatsune's child, also named Hatsune, but from here on I'll call her by her last name, Miyama, is in her mid-teens, living a fairly normal, if quiet life for her age outside of her home. Within it, however, nothing is really right. Miyama has no idea who her father is and is instead raised only by Kanako, now in her 30s, mentally mentally and physically unchanged from her teens due to her transformation into a Jorogumo. While she is marginally present for Miyama and does some simple tasks, she just sits there most of the time, smiling, staring off into space as if something is missing from her. Were it not for her father providing income for both of them, they likely wouldn't even have a place to live. Everything begins to change from this unsettling status quo, however, when one day, after a horrible encounter with a cruel old man, Miyama arrives home to shower and finds blood between her legs. While she thinks at the beginning that it's her first period, what it turns out to be shocks her even more, as in an instant, her right arm begins to throb in horrendous pain, and without warning, it transforms into a grotesque claw. Kanako runs in to see what just happened as Miyama is horrified and screams for her to go away, but Kanako persists, and when she sees what's there, she just stands there and begins crying before murmuring out a name.
One-sama.
If Kanako was not gone before, not frozen in her past before, then surely she is in this moment as she walks towards Miyama, shouting the name of her loved one and attempting to kiss her own child in a moment of dementia. Miyama, in response, simply runs away. Still wet from her shower with her clothes hurriedly thrown on, she runs to wherever she can where no one will see her in her grotesque claw, ultimately arriving at a local Shinto shrine. But even there, horrors call out to her. A voice from beyond the grave of a pained man who seems as if he's been trapped there in a state of undying.
You are a monster. You are the child of an arachnid. You are a Jorogumo. You are not a human.
No matter how much Miyama yells at this voice to stop, to explain clearly who or what she is and how she even came into this world, the onslaught continues, even as the man from earlier returns to attack her again, and Miyama is forced to use her newfound powers to try and protect herself. The end only comes when she flees the scene and returns home to her mother, her claw under her control finally. Disheveled and filled with fear, the first words she can manage to say are,
"Mom, what am I?"
To which Kanako says,
You're Hatsune, right?
Okay, but then who is this Oni-sama? My mother, through her charming laughter, said to me,
It's you, silly.
Miyama, torn and distraught, calls her grandfather to tell him that she wants him to take custody of Kanako and for her to be able to live alone in Tokyo, away from everything. Full of regret for how he neglected his daughter during her most vulnerable years, and wanting to do whatever he can to help his granddaughter live a happy life, he listens to her every word and obliges. And for Kanako, unaware of what's about to happen, she simply speaks to Miyama like normal. She simply hands Miyama a present like normal, a new sweater.
My heart and my right hand were full of pain, and we just stood there for a while, staring at each other.
Next series of Atlach Nacha, despite its goofily long-winded name, is an incredible encapsulation of all the themes within Atlach Nacha, and perhaps the most perfect continuation of Kanako's decision possible. Besides the horror of watching someone you love losing their mind to dementia, which is so horrifyingly and saddeningly executed, it shows that for humans, for any living thing, it is simply not possible to hold on to anything for eternity. To do so will strip it of all that was once beautiful and turn it into something which hurts you and those around you. While we may see it as a way for us to gain the power to do right in the world forever, to fight back against what has wronged us forever, to hold on to the same exact feelings forever, it also makes us unable to grow or change anymore, racked with pain that we can't forget. Hatsune thinks to herself as much at one point during Atlach Nacha, that even though she's lived for hundreds of years, the pain of what Shirogane did to her still festers in her. It is what truly turned her into a monster, knowing that that would never end. And this much goes for Kanako as well. Unwilling to accept that things in the world of humans are temporary, foolishly believing that she could take on a burden as great as eternal life, Kanako found herself crumbling under the pressure of that existence. She became a husk of herself, absorbed in the past and unable to do anything for anyone in the present. Her daughter suffering many of the same pains that her and Hatsune did, as well as just simply not being there for her as she grew up. There's a lot of ways you can read into this, with one of the most obvious being how trauma freezes you in time, but as I've already delved deep into that idea in my video on Gore Screaming Show, I instead want to talk about something else very related to trauma, the systems that lead to it. Because Atlach Nacha does not portray what happened to Hatsune and by extension Kanako as part of an isolated incident. Through the reveal of Shirogane's true intentions and his past, it is made explicit that there are intentional forces and causes behind it. Shirogane says as much himself in the ending that everything he did was for his own amusement. Both Hatsune and the shrine maiden he saved were purely to give himself some sort of new entertainment, toys to play with, and even the child he bore with the maiden was not because of love, but because he got bored and wanted something new to do. A child, for the record, that he sexually assaults for his entertainment. Even though Shirogane is just a man who, through some mythical means, obtained power beyond what any human should have, he paints himself as a god that deserves to rule over others and do whatever he pleases with them, showing little to no empathy except where it could possibly garner him allies or hide his true intentions from people who don't know his tricks. What happened to Hatsune is but one of his many sins, but she is the only one he could never truly hide, and she became a villain for it. Scriptures and history altered to write her perspective out of it. Shirogane is, as a misogynistic, manipulative, and cruel force that particularly targets women, that exists in perpetuity and leads people to have to do horrible things to survive, very easily read as a metaphor for patriarchal power, which by itself adds an immense amount to Hatsune's character on a basic level. She's not some evil femme fatale female vampire archetype because women are evil in uniquely brutal ways. She is like this because an oppressive, abusive, and opportunistic force turned her into it through violence. A force that is, as elucidated in his rhetoric and the prequel novel especially, infinitely fucking worse than her. But through framing himself as a figure of peace and order, and even as it seems, like I mentioned before, for writing the very scriptures which define the local myths of the community, he is able to reframe the narrative of Hatsune as the villain and him as a noble hero, which is a perspective that you, dear reader, likely held until you started to piece together that Shirogane is not all that he's portrayed to be by himself in the legends. The game really plays you like a fool until the final moments when you realize that Hatsune's actions had reasons behind them, that all these stories of an evil witch and a woman being destroyed were stories of her. She saved Kanako because the assault reminded her of her own brutalization, and she continued to fight for her in often cruel ways to protect her. She killed so many people in order to try and save others on the whole from the same fate she had suffered. And yet, in the end, she committed so many horrible acts for this. She still couldn't leave it all behind, and she hurt the one she loved most by giving them eternity, hoping it might be different this time. Hatsune is in no way a hero, and she herself admits this much by the end. Even though what she wanted was to defeat the source of all evils, she still embodied much of it. She played with her prey, killed wholly innocent people, and hurt others for no reason. She manipulated everyone around her and even failed to save the one she wanted to protect the most. Hatsune is a horrible, terrible person who was made this way by an even worse person who saved her in a time of need. And what is okay to sacrifice in order to stop this? Atlach Nacha's ending begs this question, but it doesn't give an answer. We learn that there are reasons for injustices, that they can be ended, or at least hurt, but doing so will inevitably require sacrifices even if we don't intend to. People will die to authority, people will die for that authority, and people will die to those trying to destroy it, and we don't know who any of them might be. Some of those people who die may be abjectly horrible, but some may be innocent, and some more ambiguous. And I think this is what I find most interesting about Hatsune's character in the end. She is an embodiment about how messy and frightening it is to try and end evil at its roots, and that the process will never be clean. Not necessarily by the will of people who want to do good, but simply because of the world that the people who are terrible have created. We can be idealistic and strive for as little violence as we can, and I believe that is right, but then look at recent history. We only got marginal recognition for minority rights by people constantly protesting and rioting, putting themselves on the line, and at times getting murdered by authority, by people who could have been allies but chose to sympathize with it. What Atlach Nacha shows is that there is no way in the world we live in to avoid sacrifices being made for good. If we do nothing, then tyranny reigns supreme and people die quietly en masse. If we fight back, then perhaps we may win, but it will be even more obvious to us that we're surrounded by death, by sacrifice, all because a bunch of people fashioned themselves as gods. We need protesting and rioting. We need to find ways to attack systemic oppression and brutality at its sources and build something better, but I hate seeing people die for it by the same hands they're trying to swat away. I feel uneasy knowing what allows me to live with even marginal security, as a trans woman was built on so much spilt blood, lives taken far sooner than they should have been. Yet I feel even more uneasy, knowing that if we do nothing, people will die anyways, in greater numbers, yet far more quietly. At least we can strive for peace, strive to minimize the harm. The people who will kill us if we do nothing are brazen about how much they enjoy the murder. I believe fighting back while doing everything we can to preserve ourselves, to be as peaceful as possible until our hands are forced, is the best option we have. To build community, to create solidarity, to foster empathy. But I know that even in the most peaceful routes possible, hands will be forced to violence eventually, because the nation states themselves are using violence cloaked in kindness, words of vile concealed in religion, and desires to the toy of life said brazenly when given the stage to do so. I don't know how to reconcile what it means for people to become unwitting sacrifices to this, but I do know I can do what they were fighting for and try to live happily. Live as myself, loudly, and so everyone can hear it, never hiding what I am and doing my damnedest to make sure I and others like me can't be pushed in submission again. Doing every single thing I can to make people realize that we exist, that we deserve love, and hopefully convincing at least a few of it. We only have one life after all, and I don't want to spend that one short life full of regret. I feel like if eternal life really existed, then this drive of mine to do good wouldn't exist. You know, it's a big topic these days. So many of the millionaires and wannabes are obsessed with living forever, running God knows how many companies dedicated to measuring health statistics and optimizing body stats, running a ridiculous number of tests to push the human lifespan as far as is possible, looking at every possible thing to stop aging. Of course, humans have been obsessed with this even before the days of big capitalism and longevity protein or whatever the shit Brian Johnson is peddling now. You can find infinite stories of rulers in olden times drinking blood or dubious elixirs to prolong their reign, desperately hoping to preserve their power so they continue to be tyrants for all eternity. And so much of religion is centered around it as an end goal. Buddhism has its whole escaping samsara thing, and Christianity promises eternal joy if you're a good girl who doesn't suck too many dicks. Fortunately, I've sucked at least 5, so I'm disqualified. Something that reading Atlach Nacha really made me think about, though, is why exactly do we want eternal life? Well, it's ostensibly so they can preserve our happiness forever, to live as Kanako imagined with her beloved One-sama. That reality is fundamentally incompatible with not only the rest of humanity, but human nature itself. By becoming immortal as Shirogane and Hatsune had, we find ourselves frozen in our past, wandering husks still shackled by our desires, but piling on trauma and suffering for far longer than any human should ever be allowed to experience. Eternal life doesn't give us an opportunity to ascend or escape our hunger. It only makes us care less and less for how we fulfill it. Life and death carry no meaning anymore, and with it, neither does the temporality of anything, knowing you'll be able to find some new joy elsewhere given, I don't know, 100 years, 200, maybe the new faraway era will have something. You don't even need to do anything to make it happen. Just sit there in your old ways and rot. Paraphrasing what Shirogane says in the tie-in novel, humans die, but the inhuman escape destiny, and they become antiquities. By something becoming eternal, by enshrining eternal systems, the past clashes with the present. It becomes a rot, vintage ideals of cruelty that conflict with a world full of people that more than ever wish to know about others, to be empathetic and loving. The eternal systems in our world are not in truth undeniable gospels, but violence enshrined in righteous words of the past that encourage violence, that discourage empathy and love. When I think back on my life, I feel like so much of my optimism and what I treasured was on the basis that I might never get to appreciate it again. I felt that because I only have one short life, I should really make it count. I should really try and do what I can with it and build on what others did for me, so in turn, future generations can build for it. But for me, I always think there's only so many times I'm gonna get to see flowers bloom. So many times I can hold my beloved tight and tell them how important they are to me. So many times I can create music that says my feelings through sound better than words ever could. Not only will I eventually pass decades from now, but I also won't get to experience all these things forever. I'm not eternally youthful, and in a long time from now, I might become hard of hearing. I might go blind. My sense of touch might dim. I might need to be reminded of things more often. I won't ever be frozen in time. I will always be changing, always be transforming, always becoming something different. It really is like a flower. They might bloom the same every year, but they are always different in some way. I think I like being that way. Knowing that I won't last forever and that the world around me may not either, it constantly pushes me to keep fighting on and growing, rather than becoming complacent and a relic. I know it's cliche to say that death gives life meaning, that pain gives joy meaning, but I really think it's true. Suffering isn't just, but it will happen no matter what, and I feel we owe it to each other to look at it, to understand it, and to battle against it, rather than scoffing at those being hurt or even joining in the oppression. No matter how it's built, no matter how many times people say things are the way that they are, that tradition is immortal, it is anything but. Though we may be hurt along the path of being ourselves, that is no reason for us to all give in, to stop existing as we are and submit. People have fought to end the suffering of the oppressed for as long as there have been oppressed, and we have every right to live as ourselves and fight simply by living. And by banding together with those fighting, we create a better world even for those who do conform naturally. Even if now is scarier than ever before, even if we are under greater threat than ever before, that is only more reason for us to live loudly, to foster community and to support each other so as many of us can live as possible. So we can fight for a future where there are fewer sacrifices and fewer false gods. Because nothing lasts forever. Not even eternity. At around 10 hours to see everything within the game, do I recommend going through Atlach Nacha? Well, as I always seem to say on this channel, if it isn't already clear, abso-fucking-lutely. I'd even say it's worth the extra few hours to go through the prequel light novel and the half hour to go for the online short story. It's just unfortunate that as I write this, Atlach Nacha is maybe one of the least accessible games I've covered. While AliceSoft released all their pre-1997 games, such as Toshin Toshi 2, as freeware in a fantastic move for game preservation, that cutoff sadly means that Atlach Nacha didn't make, well, the cut. As a result, the only way to access the game is through purchasing a physical copy of the game compilation it was originally released in, or the later year 2000 standalone release. Neither of these is exactly ideal though, given how antiquated the game engine is nowadays, and the 2000 release is particularly egregious as Sophorine did a Sophorine and forced AliceSoft to make a number of changes, ranging from calling the high school just a skull, which is fine, to major rewrites regarding an optional subplot for Takahiro and Tsugumi, plus a bunch of other stuff. Can't have the Yuri be too toxic, I guess. Just to add salt on the wound, too, the absolutely fantastic prequel light novel, which I pulled from a fair bit in my analysis, as well as the summary of Hatsune's past in the spoiler segment, seemingly only ever got one print run. So while its going used rate of around 3,000 yen isn't the most egregious cost for a used book out there, that's still more money than buying some entire series of light novels. At the very least, some of what Fumiya later wrote is accessible. Not a lot, but titles like Gaozu Ion and works she assisted on, such as Daite Goku, are readily available on Friend of Channel DL site, with the most notable of those being Toshin Toshi Free. I have heard many times that it is a video game that exists, a prime video essay topic. Most particularly, I've heard the gameplay and plot structure is a mess, but it has a very fascinating endgame of a clever spin and expansion of Atlach Nacha's ideas. It also has gay sex and hot nuns, so perhaps in the near future that'll be something I have to tackle. Nun sex aside, I really hope that someday soon we see a re-release of this game with all of its bits intact, because every part of Atlach Nacha is seriously worth experiencing, sans the technical difficulties surrounding it. But Fumiya and the rest of the team at AliceSoft cooked up with this is not just entertaining as some fucked up toxic Yuri and bisexual shenanigans, but a fascinating dive into the sacrifices entailed in making the world a better place, the horrors of eternity, cycles of abuse, and so much else. Happy holidays, everybody, and stay strong.